Hey everyone, welcome back. Ready to level up your coding game?
Always.
Today we're diving deep into the world of coding challenges.
Oh, yeah. Those can be tough.
But specifically, we're focusing on building the mental toughness to really conquer them.
The mental game is huge for sure.
Absolutely. We're going to be taking a close look at this fantastic Algo Academy blog post, and let me tell you, it is packed with insights.
Algo Academy always has great stuff. Practical.
Exactly, and that's what we're all about here. Whether you're a seasoned coder or just starting out, this deep dive will give you some really actionable strategies to boost your mental game.
Love it.
So to kick things off, what really struck me about this blog is how it goes beyond just grit. It really dissects what mental toughness means in the context of coding.
Yeah, it's not just about powering through.
Right. It breaks it down into these specific elements like focus, perseverance, and that ability to perform under pressure.
Which is, let's be honest, where the magic happens, right?
Totally. It's like, how do you keep a cool head when the clock is ticking and you're facing a problem you've never seen before?
Exactly. And the blog really emphasizes this idea of seeing challenges as opportunities for growth, not just roadblocks.
It's almost like mental weightlifting, right?
I like that. You're building those mental muscles.
And speaking of weightlifting, the blog specifically calls out those FAing companies.
Yes. Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Netflix, Google.
The giants.
The giants.
Yeah.
And their interview processes, notoriously tough.
Notoriously tough is right, like mental Olympics of coding almost.
Yeah.
And I mean, I've heard stories about those interviews that could make even the most experienced coder break a sweat.
Oh, absolutely. I've been there.
But it sounds like it's not just about knowing the syntax, right?
Right. It's so much more than just memorizing code. It's about problem solving on the fly, thinking critically, and yeah, not letting that pressure get to you.
So what kind of tools does the blog give us to actually build that mental strength?
Well, they start by really emphasizing the importance of a growth mindset,
Yeah.
which is all about seeing those mistakes not as failures,
Right.
but as stepping stones.
I can see how that would be super valuable, especially when you're wrestling with a really tricky problem.
Totally. Instead of getting discouraged, you see it as a chance to learn something new.
Exactly. And the blog really hits hard on the importance of consistent practice.
Oh, yeah. That's fundamental. It might seem obvious.
Right.
But that consistent coding, working through all those different challenges, that's how you build those mental muscles.
Makes sense.
They even suggest simulating the pressure of an actual interview.
Oh, interesting. How do they suggest doing that?
Well, like timing yourself,
Okay.
talking through your thought process out loud,
Oh, okay.
even doing mock interviews with friends or colleagues.
That's such a good idea. It's like training for a marathon, but for your brain.
Right. And speaking of training, they also lay out a really helpful problem-solving framework, a step-by-step system.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Break it down for me. What are the steps?
All right, so step one, they say it starts with really understanding the problem,
Got it.
like dissecting it, making sure you are crystal clear on what's being asked.
Okay.
Then you plan your approach, thinking through different strategies, choosing the most effective one.
Right, so not just jumping in blindly.
Exactly. Then you implement your solution. That's where the actual coding comes in.
Okay.
And finally, you test and refine, debugging, optimizing, making sure that code works as intended.
See, that makes a lot of sense because breaking it down into smaller steps like that just feels a lot less overwhelming
Yeah, totally.
than just staring at a blank screen and trying to figure it all out at once.
Right. It's like those divide and conquer algorithms we use.
Exactly. You're breaking the problem into smaller, more manageable pieces.
Exactly. And this whole framework ties in really well with the idea of learning from those quote-unquote failures.
I like that.
Instead of getting frustrated when things go wrong, you use those moments to analyze what happened,
Yeah.
See if you can spot patterns in your struggles and turn those into opportunities for growth.
So it's like each coding challenge, whether you succeed in the traditional sense or not,
Yeah.
is actually giving you valuable data that you can then use to get better.
Precisely. It's all about building that feedback loop. Now, the cool thing is, the blog doesn't just focus on the technical side. They also recognize how important mental and emotional well-being is.
Oh, for sure. I mean, especially in a field that can be so demanding.
Yeah, very demanding.
And sometimes even isolating.
Very isolating. I think every coder has felt that sense of isolation at some point, especially when you're stuck on a problem and it feels like you're the only one who doesn't get it.
Oh, absolutely. So what kind of advice does the blog offer for that side of things, the mental and emotional well-being?
Well, they suggest incorporating mindfulness practices,
Okay.
things like deep breathing or meditation. Even just taking short breaks to kind of clear your head.
Yeah, those can make a world of difference.
It really can, just in terms of like focus and stress management.
Absolutely.
And they also emphasize the importance of building a supportive community,
That's so key.
connecting with other coders.
Yeah.
Through forums, study groups, pair programming. It's a reminder that you're not alone in this.
That's so crucial, right?
It is.
Because it's like having a team of people who just get it.
Totally.
They understand the ups and downs of coding.
Yes.
And they're there to offer encouragement and support when you need it most.
Absolutely. It's like having your own personal cheer squad for those late night coding sessions.
I love that. Okay, so we've talked about mindset, we've talked about practice, we've talked about this problem-solving framework, but the blog also digs into specific techniques for tackling different types of coding challenges.
Yes. And this is where things get really fun.
Okay, I'm all ears. What kind of categories are we talking about here?
Well, they cover some of the most common ones that tend to pop up in technical interviews, like array manipulation, string manipulation,
Okay.
and that big one, dynamic programming. And they actually break down specific techniques within each category.
Oh, nice. So it's like having this toolbox with different tools for different coding tasks.
That's a great way to put it.
Instead of feeling lost, you know exactly which tool to grab. Can you give me like a sneak peek into some of the techniques they highlight?
Oh, absolutely. So for array manipulation, they talk about the two-pointer technique, which is super efficient for certain types of problems.
Okay, so like what kind of problems?
Imagine you're trying to find two numbers in an array that add up to a specific target value.
Got it.
Using two pointers to simultaneously scan through the array can be way faster than just a brute force approach.
So it's like you're optimizing your search by strategically using those two pointers instead of blindly checking every possible combination.
Exactly. It's all about efficiency.
Very cool.
Yeah.
What about string manipulation? What kind of tools do they recommend for those challenges?
They really highlight the use of hash tables. They're incredibly powerful for things like counting the frequency of characters in a string or checking if two strings are anagrams.
Oh, interesting. So like if you were trying to see if two words use the same letters but just in a different order, a hash table could help you keep track of how many times each letter appears.
Precisely. The blog actually uses the anagram example to illustrate this.
Very cool.
But, and this is important, they also stress paying attention to those edge cases.
Okay, now when you say edge cases, do you mean like those unusual scenarios that you might not think of right away?
Exactly. Things that could cause your code to break if you haven't prepared for them.
Gotcha. So like what kind of edge cases?
Well, think about things like case sensitivity, empty strings, strings with special characters, you know.
Right. Those can definitely throw a wrench in the works.
Absolutely. And you need to make sure your code can handle those gracefully. It's like thinking defensively.
Right. Anticipating those potential problems and building your code to be robust enough to handle them.
Exactly. Which is especially important in a high-pressure setting, like a coding interview.
Makes total sense.
Yeah.
Now, the blog mentioned linked lists, but they didn't really dive into specifics too much.
True. Linked lists can be tricky because you're dealing with pointers.
Yeah, those can feel abstract sometimes.
But the key takeaway is to really practice those fundamental operations,
Right.
like insertion, deletion, reversal.
So you're saying getting comfortable with those basic building blocks is crucial.
It really is, before you even try to tackle those more complex linked list problems. And you know what else is super helpful for linked lists? The two-pointer technique.
It's like that technique is the MVP of coding challenges.
Seriously, it comes up everywhere, especially for linked list problems like cycle detection or finding the middle element.
It's like that one tool you always reach for in your toolbox. Okay, so we've touched on arrays, strings, linked lists. Now let's talk about trees and graphs.
Ah, yes. Those data structures that often represent relationships between different pieces of data.
I've always found trees and graphs so fascinating, but they can also be pretty intimidating, especially when you start talking about all those different traversal algorithms.
Oh, for sure. It can get complex fast. But the blog really stresses the importance of mastering those two fundamental search algorithms, depth first search, or DFS, and breadth first search, BFS.
So those are like your go-to ways to navigate through a tree or graph.
They are. It's like having two different strategies for exploring a maze.
Okay, I like that analogy.
DFS is like going down one path as far as you can before backtracking,
Got it.
while BFS explores all the immediate options at each level before moving on to the next one.
So depending on what you're trying to find within that tree or graph,
Yeah.
you might choose one over the other.
Exactly.
It's like having different search strategies for different scenarios.
Right. And the blog also highlights different types of trees, like binary trees and binary search trees.
So you have to recognize what kind of tree you're dealing with,
Yes. Each type has its own unique properties, you know.
which will influence how you approach the problem.
Exactly. Okay, are you ready to tackle the beast?
Oh, here we go. I knew this was coming.
Dynamic programming.
I've heard tales, about dynamic programming. Supposedly notoriously difficult, but also incredibly rewarding to solve.
Very rewarding.
What kind of guidance does the blog give us for those?
All right, the key concept here is breaking down a complex problem into smaller, overlapping subproblems.
Okay.
Instead of solving the same subproblem over and over again, you store the results and reuse them when you need to.
So it's all about optimization, right? Finding ways to avoid doing unnecessary work.
Exactly. And they use the classic example of the Fibonacci sequence to explain this.
Oh, Fibonacci sequence, yeah.
Remember how each number in the sequence is the sum of the two numbers before it?
Yeah, I remember that.
Dynamic programming lets you calculate each number efficiently by building on the values you've already calculated.
So instead of starting from scratch each time, you're leveraging what you've already done.
Right. It's like building a tower brick by brick instead of trying to build each level independently.
Makes a lot of sense. Now, the blog mentions two main approaches to dynamic programming, top-down and bottom-up. Could you unpack those a little?
Of course. So top-down, which is also called memoization.
Okay.
It's basically like keeping a cheat sheet where you write down the answers to problems you've already solved so you don't have to calculate them again.
Oh, that's smart.
Right.
And what about bottom-up?
Bottom-up, also called tabulation, is more like building a table.
Okay.
Where you systematically fill in the solutions to subproblems, starting with the most basic ones and working your way up.
So they're like two different organizational strategies, essentially.
Exactly. And the blog even provides code examples for both memoization and tabulation so you can really see them in action.
I love that. Concrete examples make a huge difference.
Okay.
So we've covered a lot of ground here.
We have.
From array manipulation all the way to dynamic programming, and it sounds like this blog post is packed with incredibly actionable advice. But knowing the techniques is only one part of the equation, right?
You got it.
Because sometimes the biggest obstacles are those mental blocks.
The mental game is everything.
And we're going to tackle those head on in part 2 of our deep dive, so stay tuned. All right, welcome back. So last time, we really laid that groundwork right. We talked about the importance of growth mindset, that consistent practice, and even that step-by-step problem-solving framework. But now I'm ready to get into the nitty-gritty, like those specific techniques for different types of coding challenges.
Let's do it. Things get really interesting here. Let's start with array manipulation, one of the most common types you'll see.
Okay, so like rearranging elements, right?
Yeah.
Searching, finding patterns within an array.
Exactly. Think about a scenario where you have, say, a list of numbers, and you need to find the pair that adds up to a certain target sum. Or if you need to sort a list efficiently.
Right, right.
So one technique they really emphasize is the two-pointer approach. Super useful for those problems where you need to compare elements at different positions in the array.
Instead of using nested loops, which can be a real drag on performance.
Huge drag. The two-pointer approach is so much more efficient.
So it's like having two fingers scanning through the list instead of going back and forth repeatedly.
Exactly. And the blog actually gives that classic two-sum problem as an example.
Oh, yeah.
Where you're trying to find those two numbers that add up to a specific value. And with this two-pointer approach, you can do it in linear time.
Which is a big deal, especially as the size of the array grows.
Huge difference. Now, how about string manipulation? Those challenges can be tricky too.
They can be. Any specific techniques that stand out for you?
One key takeaway is the power of hash tables. Really useful for tasks like, counting how many times each character appears in a string.
Right.
Or checking if two strings are anagrams of each other.
Anagrams. So like if you're trying to see if two words have the same letters but rearranged, a hash table could help you keep track of that.
Exactly. They use that exact example in the blog.
Cool.
But they also warn about watching out for those edge cases, you know?
Those edge cases. By edge cases, you mean those unexpected scenarios, right?
Exactly. Things that could potentially trip up your code if you haven't thought about them.
Right. So like what? Give me some examples.
Well, you got to consider things like case sensitivity, empty strings, or strings with special characters. All those things can throw a wrench in the works if you're not careful.
And you want your code to be robust.
Right.
like able to handle those curveballs.
Exactly. It's almost like coding defensively, anticipating those potential issues and making sure your code can handle them gracefully.
That's such a good point, especially in those high-stakes scenarios, like a coding interview.
Absolutely. Okay, now, the blog mentioned linked lists, but didn't go into too much detail. What's your take on those?
Linked lists can be tough.
They can. You're dealing with pointers, which, some people find a little abstract at first,
Yes,
but
personally.
they emphasize practicing those fundamental operations.
Like what kind of operations are we talking about?
Things like insertion, deletion, and reversal. Getting really comfortable with those is key.
It's like mastering the basics before you move on to the fancier stuff.
Exactly. And you know what else is super helpful for linked lists?
Let me guess. The two-pointer technique.
You got it. Especially for problems like detecting cycles in a linked list or finding the middle element.
That two-pointer technique is a real workhorse.
It is. It's like the Swiss Army knife of coding challenges.
Okay, let's move on to trees and graphs. Always found those fascinating.
Ah, yes. They can be really interesting. They often represent those relationships between different pieces of data. But they can be intimidating, too. All those different traversal algorithms, especially.
I've always found them a bit overwhelming.
Totally. But the blog stresses the importance of really mastering those two fundamental search algorithms, depth first search, DFS, and breadth first search, BFS. Those are key.
So like two different ways to explore the tree or graph, right?
Exactly. They're like two different approaches to navigating a maze.
Okay, I love that analogy.
So with DFS, you go down one path as far as you can before you backtrack, while BFS explores all the immediate options at each level before moving on to the next.
So depending on what you're trying to find, you might choose one algorithm over the other.
Precisely.
It's like having different search strategies in your back pocket.
Right. And they also point out that it's not just about knowing the algorithms. You also have to recognize the specific type of tree you're working with. Like, is it a binary tree, a binary search tree?
Right, because those have their own unique properties, and that'll affect how you approach the problem.
Exactly. Okay, are you ready to tackle the one that everyone's a little scared of?
Oh, I knew this was coming.
Dynamic programming.
I've heard the legends. Notoriously difficult, but also incredibly rewarding once you crack the code.
Oh, super rewarding. It's like solving a puzzle.
So, how do they recommend approaching these dynamic programming challenges?
All right, the key concept here is to break down a complex problem into smaller, overlapping subproblems.
Okay.
Instead of solving the same subproblem again and again, you store the results from the first time and reuse them when you need them again.
So it's all about optimization, right? Working smarter, not harder.
You got it. And they use that classic example of the Fibonacci sequence to illustrate this.
Oh yeah, the Fibonacci sequence. I remember learning about that.
Each number in that sequence is the sum of the two numbers that come before it, right?
Right.
Well, dynamic programming helps you efficiently calculate each number by building on those values you've already calculated.
So instead of starting from scratch every time, you're leveraging what you've already done.
Precisely. Like building a tower brick by brick.
Makes sense. Much more efficient than trying to build each level independently. Now, the blog mentioned two main approaches to dynamic programming: top-down and bottom-up.
Yes. Top-down is also called memoization.
Memoization.
It's kind of like keeping a cheat sheet where you jot down the answers to problems you've already solved.
Smart, so you don't waste time recalculating.
Exactly. Then you have bottom-up, also called tabulation.
Tabulation.
That's more like building a table where you systematically fill in the solutions to those subproblems, starting with the simplest ones.
So two different strategies for approaching the same type of problem.
Exactly. And they even give code examples in the blog for both memoization and tabulation, so you can really see them in action.
I always appreciate concrete examples. Okay, so we've covered a ton of ground here, from arrays to dynamic programming. And it sounds like this blog post has given us a treasure trove of techniques.
It really has.
But knowing these techniques is just one piece of the puzzle, right? Because sometimes the toughest battles are the ones we fight in our own heads.
The mental game is huge.
Those mental blocks can really sabotage us even when we know the technical stuff.
Oh yeah, for sure. And we're going to tackle those head on in the next part of our deep dive, so stay tuned.
Welcome back. We've covered so much ground already, talking about techniques for different types of coding challenges. But now it's time to get real, right?
Time to get real.
Because sometimes the biggest hurdle isn't the code itself.
It's our own mind.
It's that inner critic, that voice that tells us we're not good enough.
Oh, that voice. We all know it too well.
And the Algo Academy blog really doesn't shy away from that. They dedicate a whole section to these mental blocks that can really trip us up.
Yeah, and we all face them no matter how experienced we are. They're part of the journey.
It's so true. Like you're staring at a problem, and suddenly that little voice pops up. You can't do this, it whispers. Everyone else gets it but you.
Classic imposter syndrome. It's so common, especially in coding. Always something new to learn, always someone who seems to know more than you.
Exactly. And I think it can be really discouraging, especially for beginners.
No.
So what does the blog suggest for dealing with imposter syndrome?
Well, they emphasize focusing on your own progress, not comparing yourself to others.
It's so easy to get caught in that trap, right? Scrolling through LinkedIn and seeing everyone's amazing achievements and feeling like you're not doing enough.
It's a recipe for self-doubt, that's for sure.
But if we can shift our focus
Right? Yeah.
to how far we've come, the skills we've developed, the problems we've solved.
Celebrate those wins, even the small ones.
Exactly. Those small wins are huge. Those aha moments when you finally figure something out.
That's the fuel that keeps you going. That's where the confidence comes from.
Okay, another mental block they talk about is analysis paralysis. This one gets me all the time. It's that feeling of being so overwhelmed by a problem that you just freeze up, you overthink it, and then you can't even get started.
Oh, I know that feeling. Staring at a blank screen, cursor blinking, mind racing.
Exactly. So what's the antidote to analysis paralysis?
The blog actually suggests something pretty simple. Just start.
Just start.
Yep.
Yeah.
Even if it's a brute force approach, just get something down on the screen.
So don't worry about making it perfect right away. Just get the ball rolling.
Exactly. Sometimes the act of writing code, even messy code, can help you understand the problem better.
It's like you have to start walking before you can run.
Right. And sometimes that first step is the hardest.
Okay, let's talk about perfectionism. This one is a big one for me, and I think it can be especially tricky in coding. That drive to make everything perfect, even when it's not necessary.
It's a double-edged sword, right? Striving for excellence is great, but it can also become a stumbling block.
Especially in a time-constrained setting like a coding challenge or a technical interview.
Exactly. The blog reminds us that sometimes getting a working solution, even if it's not the most elegant, is more important than trying to achieve perfection.
It's like, in a race, the goal is to cross the finish line, not to have the prettiest running form.
I love that analogy.
So it's about being pragmatic, right?
Yeah.
Prioritizing functionality over flawless code.
Exactly. And they have a good tip for that too. They suggest using comments to mark those areas where you might want to go back and optimize later.
That's so smart.
Yeah.
So you're acknowledging that there might be room for improvement without letting it completely derail you.
Exactly. It's about finding that balance.
Mm.
Okay, now this last mental block, I think it's the one we all struggle with the most.
Oh, I know it's coming. Fear of failure.
Yep. It's the big one.
It can be paralyzing, especially when you're facing a high-stakes coding interview.
The pressure is on, and what happens is we start to fear making mistakes. We're afraid of looking foolish, of not measuring up.
And that fear can really hold us back from taking risks, from trying new things.
Absolutely. So what the blog suggests is reframing failure.
Oh, okay.
Instead of seeing it as something to be avoided at all costs, they encourage us to see it as a learning opportunity.
It's like that saying, you either win or you learn.
Exactly.
So it's about shifting that perspective, seeing those mistakes as valuable data points.
Right. They're not setbacks, they're stepping stones.
I love that. Now, the blog also emphasizes the power of positive self-talk.
Oh yeah, your inner dialogue is so important.
Instead of letting those negative thoughts spiral, they encourage us to counteract them with affirmations, reminders of our strengths, our past successes.
Be your own cheerleader, especially when things get tough.
We all need a hype person, right? And sometimes we have to be that person for ourselves.
Absolutely. And remember, mental toughness is not some innate quality, you know? It's not like you're born with it or you're not. It's a skill.
A skill that can be developed.
Exactly. You can train it just like you would train a muscle. It takes practice, it takes perseverance, and it takes self-awareness.
And I love how the Algo Academy blog closes with this analogy of coding being like fitness training. You don't just wake up one day and run a marathon, right?
Right. It takes consistent effort.
You have to push your limits. You have to recover from setbacks. You have to keep showing up.
And there will be days when you feel great, super strong and motivated. And there will be days when you just want to quit.
Oh, for sure. Those days are inevitable.
But the key is to keep going. to trust the process, to remember why you started in the first place.
And that's a message that resonates far beyond just coding. That's a life lesson right there.
It really is. This deep dive has given us a roadmap, it's given us a toolkit, it's given us that pep talk. Now it's up to us to take that and build the mental toughness we need to conquer any challenge that comes our way, coding or otherwise.
Beautifully said. And remember, you're not alone in this journey. There's a whole community of coders out there facing the same challenges, supporting each other every step of the way.
Exactly. So keep learning, keep practicing, keep believing in yourself. You got this.
And that's a wrap on another deep dive. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.